Hello, good afternoon to everybody. Thanks very much for coming, and thank you to Professors Magda Teter, Daniel Sawyer, Shoban, and all the team from Fordham University and the New York Public Library for giving me this opportunity of being here, researching and participating in the lectures program 2023. I will try to speak slowly, but if something is not understandable, we could go in depth at the end of the talk, of course. Well, firstly, I would like to introduce myself again and say that I have spent my childhood and teen years in a progressive Jewish institution in northern Buenos Aires, in an industrial neighborhood called Villa Lynch. Well, here you have a map of Argentina, Buenos Aires. The yellow circle is Buenos Aires City, the capital. And here in the northern of Buenos Aires City, is in red, the neighborhood Villa Lynch. So the institution that I mentioned was in Villa Lynch. The name of that institution or schule was ICUF Perez from Villa Lynch. This is important because in Argentina we have many institutions called ICUF Perez. That's why I have to mention that is from Villa Lynch. That was founded in 1940 by Jewish immigrants, socialists and communists who were textile workers, mostly from Poland. In the 60s, this center had a 6-story building, an Olympic swimming pool, a shule, a theater where prominent artists of the national scene performed, and Villa Lynch was also an important textile district known as the Argentinian Manchester. Unfortunately, the life of that great schule was relatively brief, and also was the importance of the textile industry in Argentina. The institution first closed its door in 1996, and my family and myself, we lived in Villa Lynch, we went to that schule, and we were part of that history. But what does it mean, a progressive Jewish institution like Perez from Villa Lynch? In Argentina, refers to a non-Zionist and non-religious Jewish center for education and culture, founded by leftists who arrived from Eastern Europe and were Yiddish speakers. My schule, ICUF Perez from Villa Lynch, was part of a broader network of centers which joined the League or Federation Yiddischer Kulturverband, or ICUF, Yiddischer Kulturverband. ICUF was an international federation founded in Paris in 1937 to preserve the Yiddish culture and fight against fascism and anti-Semitism. But I will be back very soon with that. So the name of this lecture is Progressive Jewish Culture in Argentina and South America, an ethno-political identity, and reflects the story of my schule and many others linked to ICUF. So that was part of my life, but later, as a researcher, I wanted to understand how it was formed, this identity, the education proposals and the culture of the communist Jews or Jewish communists, and what happened with their children and grandchildren who were born in Argentina and South America. So, one of my main working hypotheses is that this identity was created in a field of tensions between the Jewish organization hegemonized by Zionism on one side, and the directives of the Communist Party on the other side. But this network of progressive Jewish centers, coordinated by ICUF, were also emphatically dedicated to promoting education and cultural activities. My researching work not only focused in the press or the speeches generated by the leaders of the ICUF, but in the concrete and real experiences that the people, adults and children, live in those institutions. And Pérez from Villalynch was my case study when I wrote my PhD thesis. Similar stories and experiences happen in Brazil and Uruguay Jewish centers, where many of these centers, as in Argentina, are still alive and working, although, of course, they are smaller than 50 years ago. Also, ICUF League still works in Buenos Aires, joining institutions. However, when I started to investigate ICUF shules, camps, and theaters, I discovered that there was an absence of research and also difficulties in explaining the progressive Jewish identity. So, the first questions I asked myself were, if the ICUF people reject religion, Zionism, and new generations do not speak Yiddish anymore, what kind of Jews were they? Second, if they didn't act directly in the ranks of the Communist Party and good part of them were not even affiliated, what kind of communists were they? Why were their educational and cultural contributions so well recognized in the national sphere? And finally, fourth, what and how was the link between the ICUF network and the Communist Party? When I began my research work about 18 years ago, I did many interviews. In that moment, a very prominent activist, a textile woman, Raquel Malach, explained to me, Raquel Malach from Pérez, from Lanús. So you see, many Pérez. The ICUF institutions, she told me, the ICUF institutions were a creation of the Communist Party. But a few months later, another one, also very important teacher, declared the institutions were left-wing, but they had nothing to do with the party. Only a couple of leaders were card-carrying members. While another one told me, and I quote, for us to be a communist was to think in a certain way, in favor of peace, solidarity, equal human treatment, and reading the Unser Leben journal. Unser Leben was a journal from ICUF people. So, thinking in all these answers, I could realize that there was a rich problem to figure out, and soon I understood that these diverse and sometimes opposing viewpoints were due to the atmosphere and the participation of these people in popular front organizations. As you may know, the multi-party organizations that express themselves in defense of democracy and against fascism and anti-Semitism around the world since the mid-30s. These popular fronts organizations were especially headed by communists and many of these organizations were the basis for ICUF institutions. Briefly, beginning in the mid-30s, the Spanish Civil War and later the Second World War affected the political and social climate in many South American cities, especially the bigger and cosmopolitan ones like Buenos Aires, creating the fear that some of these events could be replicated in South America. And you can see, this is a photo taken in Buenos Aires, where many German immigrants became supporters of the Nazi Party. As I do not have time enough, I cannot speak in depth about the immigration process, but here you have a table with approximated figures just to give you an idea of the size of the Jewish population in our countries. This is an estimated calculation, and you can see more or less that maybe 10 to 20% was linked with progressive institutions, and why South American left-wing Jewish communities were invited to participate in the Yiddish Culture Congress in Paris in 1937. But it is worthwhile to mention that previously to the Popular Front context, in Buenos Aires, Montevideo, São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, and other cities with secular Jewish presence, since the beginning of the 20th century, there was a previous commitment with the preservation of the Jewish culture, mutual assistance among countrymen, and the creation of Yiddish schools and theaters. And of course, many of them were publicizing left-wing ideas that they brought from Europe. In the 20s, in Argentina, the leftists were mainly belonging to three political currents. Bundists, they were socialists, and they were linked with the Socialist Party. Linke Coalition, Zionists who supported diverse borrow of ideas and could be more or less socialist or communist, but they were territorialists and supporting nationality proposals. And the third, communist supporters of Lenin, non-Zionists, linked with the Yiddish section of the Communist Party from the International, the Comintern. There were Yiddish speakers. This line later became the fundamental basis of ICUF and the current that I actually study. For example, this is a picture of the first Jewish Culture Congress in 1915 in La Plata City, a city close to Buenos Aires, in a library called Max Nordau, that later belonged to ICUF network as well. They were worried about helping Jews to learn Spanish and also following the success with the Yiddish recognition as a Jewish language in the Chernobyl Congress in Ukraine from 1908, they wanted to protect, teach, and transmit the Yiddish to the new generations. After the Russian Revolution, the Comintern from the International encouraged Jews to use their Yiddish for spreading communist ideology, and that is why in the 20s, sympathies for Yiddish or Yiddish section started to grow in the Argentinian and Uruguayan Jewish streets. And this was expressed in the expansion of the Birvishan committees called PROCOR, saying that here in the United States, you call ICOR, and the worker schools, Marxist, Leninist, Yiddish schools, or in Yiddish, Arbeiterschulen. But this was a process very centralized in Buenos Aires or in Montevideo, where the main industries were located, and so Jews with more political experience were living and working, especially in textile, garment, and wood trades. Then, as you maybe know, since 1935, the Comintern abandoned the class against class line from the third period and called for the unity and building alliances in the defense of democracy with other progressive forces, especially the progressive bourgeoisie. So many Jewish immigrants joined anti-fascist organizations, and that's why liberals, socialists, and communists were fighting together in that period, and that was the context where ICUF was founded in Paris. This photo is from the Congress in Paris. When the American and French Yiddishist writers organized the first Congress of Jewish Culture, from which ICUF emerged, 23 countries were participating. Among them, 5 from Latin America: Cuba, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay. The last 2 ones represented by the famous Yiddish writer and journalist who was living in Argentina, Pinie, Katz. Then ICUF was formed in the heat of the slogans and transnational initiatives of the Popular Front, and its call for unity to fight fascism, anti-Semitism, and in defense and preservation of the Yiddish culture. I would like to mention that in North America, as you know, the ICUF played an important cultural role, publishing many books, and the famous Yiddish Kultur journal, directed by Nachman Meisel until the 60s, and then by Itche Goldberg until the beginning of the 21st century. We have the same kind of magazine in Argentina, Revista ICUF, that was published in Buenos Aires until the 60s. But in Argentina, in addition to that, ICUF played a federative role similar, I believe, to that one of the Jewish People Fraternal Order linked with International Workers' Order played in the USA. That is, ICUF Argentina organized the institutions in a network and provide them with an ideological framework. How it was? Through the congresses, the work in different commissions as education, arts, finances, and others, the progressive press work, and the political lines coming from the Jewish Commission of the Communist Party, the former Yiddish Sektie that I mentioned before. So when Pinie Katz returned from Paris along with other activists, began to organize the South American section of the ICUF and succeeded in bringing together 57 institutions from Argentina and South America in April 1941. Of course, these institutions, schools, theaters, summer camps, and especially youth and women's groups, were formed on the basis of the anti-fascist organizations that were very active since the beginning of the 30s and during the Second World War. From the end of the World War II, these institutions started to expand and diversify their activities in Argentina and South America. I mean, theaters, schools, summer camps, between others. Of course, there were significant crises in the progressive Jewish movement story. This crisis had an impact on the ICUF League and the whole network. I cannot go on at length, but I would like to mention three important international moments of big crisis for this movement that impacted in this movement. The German-Soviet Pact between 1939 and 1941, the murder of the Yiddish writers in August 1952, and the confirmation of this and many others Stalin's crimes in 1956, when Khrushchev declared in the 20th Party Congress in Moscow the impact of the 6 Days War in Israel in 1967 and the position of the Communist Party and the Soviet Union. To talk about each crisis would take me a long time. I just wanted to say that that crisis weakened the ICUF network and many vulnerable people left the institutions in those moments. Many times the dilemma was if being a good Jew or a loyal communist. So this identity was mobile and its audience was variable in the 70s, until the 70s. I mean, many non-Jewish people, in the 70s, many non-Jewish people were part of the young and kinder club groups and many other activities. Sometimes the human groups would merge, change addresses, buildings, or names, but despite this, the period of great expansion for the progressive was during the late 40s, 50s, and early 60s. And that achievement in South America was due to the socio-economical rise of immigrants, the positive image of the Soviet Union after the Second War, and later the Cuban Revolution that reinforced communist ideas in Latin America, above all among the young people. But also another small part of the new generations, maybe less politically involved, continued with their immigrant parents' legacy in the institutions, kinder clubs, sports, summer camps, but not anymore in Yiddish, just in Spanish or in Portuguese in Brazil, because they wanted to become citizens in the new countries. And this last point is very important to note because I believe that if the ICUF experience and identity was still strong during the Cold War, that was because of people's affection for the institutions and the values related to the anti-fascist struggle and memory of the Holocaust, more so, or at least in an equal part, than the narrow party line convictions. As you can see, this is a map with the cities where the progressive had or still have institutions. Argentina with 20,000 members in 1955 had the main network, but also São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, and Montevideo in Uruguay were also very important, and nowadays they are still working. Unfortunately, we do not have ICUF population census as we had in the 50s, but small groups participate in the current ICUF congresses and other initiatives. Along his history in Argentina, as in North American case, the Communist Party many times criticized ICUF schools for focusing more on Yiddish topics than on universal struggles. And at the same time, ICUF many times was accused by other Jewish organizations of only heeding Communist Party directives. So very quickly, I would like to share some conclusions about this identity. The study of the ICUF network in South America has been misunderstood from most of the research work dedicated to Jewish communities and also by those dedicated to the Communist Party. And that happened because to understand this identity, we need to cross elements from both fields at the same time. Second, the progressive Jewish identity reflects a particular construction, ethnic and political at the same time. Like Jews, these people aim to transmit the secular heritage of the Yiddishkeit from Europe, but as progressive, radical, or communist, as you want, they postulate its willing for integration into a mass socialist movement led by the Soviet Union. Third, this identity was transnational and was born in the Popular Front atmosphere, while loyalty to the Soviet Union was a common feature of this movement. It was characterized by cultural expression. For many of them, the preservation of Yiddish as a source of Jewish identity in a socialist world was fundamental, and the Bir-Bijan project represents this utopia. And also, I think it's necessary to establish differences between ICUF as a federation, ICUF as an ideology, and the people who integrated ICUF. I mean, the members and activists who acted in the institutions. These three spheres coexisted, but they were not the same, as is not the same the results of the research work in each one. And for me, to analyze the last one, I mean the real life of the people in each neighborhood, in each country, in each institution, allow us to understand many things about this complex identity. I mean, to explain the contradictory views I point out at the beginning in relation with the Communist Party, for example, I need to observe not only the journals or the official documents, but the human relationships, as Norbert Elias would say. And look, do you know this? What is this? This is a mate. This is a page of a book for children in the shules to learn English. And in this way, I could verify that the progressive Jews or the ICUF people's biggest desire was to see their children integrated as full citizens in the new homeland, something that was not possible for them in Eastern Europe. But for that, they had to fight very hard with commitment to build a human and equal world in order to avoid the tragic history happened in the Alterheim. Finally, I would like to mention that in this new stage of my research, I find myself opening doors to the same identity construction in other countries, with the collective work that we had published recently with 16 contributors from 8 countries in the Americas cultura judeo-progresista en las Américas, it is possible to understand similarities and differences in this identity besides the different contexts. I mean, the 8 countries are Canada, United States, Cuba, Mexico, Brazil, Uruguay, Chile, and Argentina. That is why I am here in New York, thanks to the scholarship granted to me by this prestigious Center for Jewish Studies at Fordham University, to take a step further in the comparative studies among countries. And that is what I'm doing now. I am looking for materials to study the relationships and contacts among progressive Jews in South America and North America in the years of the in the years after the Second World War and the Cold War. And if I may, to conclude, I would like to underline that since 2019, we have been organizing in Buenos Aires a new archive and library called Documental Center Pinie Katz from ICUF, which aims to preserve the progressive Jewish heritage, to generate and keep carefully immigrants' testimonies, to transmit this story to the new generations, and of course, to provide, this is ICUF, Revista ICUF journal from Argentina. To transmit this story to the new generations, and of course, to provide researchers with an archive where they can find documentation that allows them to build finer stories about our past and our present as left-wing Jewish people. Thank you very much. Ashaynem Dan, muchas gracias. So, thank you. Now, maybe we can go to questions. Yes. Thank you.
Anybody? Okay, so okay.
Well, I just had a question about the parrots and the naming, because you came from Zamość, but you pronounced it, the naming of the town in the beginning of your speech.
Vishalinch.
Yeah, Vishalinch. What is the relation between Vishalinch and Zamość?
No, there's no relation. No.
The neighborhood in Buenos Aires.
Yeah.
The name of?
The neighborhood.
It's
Buenos
the
Aires.
neighborhood in Buenos
Okay,
Aires.
so that's where it came from.
Yes.
Okay.
It sounds, could sound similar, but it's not. Peretz was from Samos, no? That's why you thought that it could be a relationship, but no.
Yeah, you had noted, and thank you for your visuals were excellent, as well as the accompanying notes. I really appreciated that. The center seemed to have been built, I think somewhere in the 1940s, but closed in 1996. What happened in 1996? Because it seemed to indicated that in Uruguay and in Brazil, those centers seem to have continued beyond that. So what happened and what?
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. It's wonderful because I want to mention that this is very important to me. The building closed in 1996, and it was for sale because it was too big and Jews were not anymore in the neighborhood living, they left. So, and many factories closed, so it was very depressed atmosphere, and it was for sale. I went to visit that building 10 years later, in almost 9 years later, in 2005. And I found that in the big building were the libraries, not only the Pérez one, if not the libraries from many other ICUF institutions, belonging to the network that were closed. So they used the place to put boxes full of books. When I discovered that, I started to work there inside. I asked for a volunteer group who helped me to save all these materials. I was working 2 years in the building, without electricity, with cats, rats, and we saved all these books. And now these books are the patrimony for the new center that we have founded. But the building still continue on sale. And it was very interesting because the municipality of Villa Lynch, Villa Lynch is a neighborhood in a borough that the name is San Martín. The municipality of San Martín wanted to buy the building because the swimming pool, there was a very, very important swimming pool that they want to repair and to offer for here. And they did. They bought the building, they repair I should bring a photo of the new Pérez. But the amazing thing is that they decided to conserve the name IL Pérez. It's called Playbush Pérez. So I can say that I'm almost 99% sure that it's the only one institution in Argentina that belongs to the state that is not Jewish anymore, and the name is Pérez. So this is amazing, because the neighborhood used to know that institution as Pérez, and they love Pérez. So now it's a club and a swimming pool for everyone. It's not Jewish anymore, but it conserves the name, it conserves the story. And people who left, there were small groups of activists that they joined another institution. It was very common from the 60s that when they started to disappear, they joined another one and they put together money and buildings, and they built a new one with the forces of the two that were.
And when was this new one built? And how large is it comparatively, and how far away is it from the former? Like how many kilometers away?
Well, it's in the new one that the name is Buenos Aires. Buenos Aires is in a neighborhood that the name is Villa Crespo. We used to show Villa Crepla because many Jews live in that neighborhood, and it's in the middle of the Buenos Aires city. And there is a school there, a sport camp, and our archive is inside the school. We have 2 rooms in a former classroom. They gave us this space, so inside the school. That's why it's very important for us, because we have contact with children, with teens. It's not just a library, it's a place where families and children go every day.
And how large is it compared to the one that closed in '96?
No, it's smaller,
Much
smaller.
Okay.
This was, we used to call, as in Montevideo also, palace. The activists, the ICUF people, used to call this palace for culture. and education. And they were very proud of that name. And they wanted to build all the time, that wasn't built in 1 year. It was a long process, 20 years of construction. First, the rooms for the Schule and the kindergarten, then the theater, then the sport field. Then they bought another part close to the building to do 2, 3 stage, and after 4 stage, and after the swimming pool. So, for instance, the IL Perez from Villa Lynch was founded in 1940, and the swimming pool started to be used in 1967. So you can imagine that they were. I mean, I used to say that it's like a curva, a curve. Yeah. Until 70s, it was the moment of up, of growth. Yeah, and after golden, I mean, but they, as you see, they in 70s at the peak, this institution had 3,000 members, active members, and it was, I mean, I get very sentimental with this because I saw how it was, this institution full of people. And it was for all the family at the same time, all people playing chess in the buffet, in the cafe, children in the kinder club, in the schools, running for all the space. Many sport people doing swimming pool. I mean, everyone. It was like our house, our home. Yeah, and that's. Yeah.
So they, what you call in the Argentinian context, progressive Jews, they were about 10% of the population, 20% it seemed Uruguay. What were the other Jews? What were their religious, political, ideological affiliations and by comparison?
Well, the point with the features and to count Jews always is difficult because the way of counting people is through the institutions and the census that the institutions do. So if the people is not affiliated, we don't have idea. Until the 60s, Argentinian government asked in the census, in the national census, for the religion. So we have numbers because that, but after that, we lost control of the quantities. So we don't know exactly. So this is approximated. The joint made a census in a very good one, in the 2005, and they arrived to the number 244,000 Jews in Argentina. So it's approximate, always is approximated. And of course that many of them, the immigrants who came, they declare they were Russian or they were Polish and not Jewish. So also the idea that many Russian and Polish people were Jewish is made by the institution's sources. So, saying that the other Jewish were mainly Zionist, but very secular, very secular. Argentinian community was very secular. Orthodox people were very small groups, and never had a power until now, because in the recent times there are Lubavitch and other groups who are growing, but they are not significant in the national sphere. I mean, Zionist is the current more recognized by the public opinion. I mean, we have two institutions that they were competing with ICUF. That the name of that federation is AMIA and NAIA. Maybe you know, because the attempt to AMIA in 2004, I think what? Yes. 1994. So these are the main organizations, and to belong to these organizations, the institution must respect Zionist traditions. ICUF reject to respect Zionist tradition, and that is why they, in a moment, they were participating in the moment of the unity. I mean, during the Second World War, but after, with the Iron Curtain and the Cold War, they split and they didn't join again. So mostly the institutions belong to these federations and are Zionists. Zionists from left and Zionists from right wing.
So, questions have some reactions. I'll try to put them in the form of questions. Well, one question is there were other Yiddish institutions, right? There was YIVO in Argentina, and I think now, what was the guy's name who published all those books?
Oh, Roshansky.
Roshansky.
But there's also Chico.
Chico. So, what was the relationship to those other groups? You did mention that there was a Bund, so there were other Yiddish things going on.
Yeah.
And then I just wanted to say that it's very striking that the pictures, like the first picture you have the children in school from the 1920s, there's a picture of Lenin.
Yeah.
Right? And when the Popular Front comes in, it's Peretz and Shalom Aleichem and so on.
Yeah.
And that stays that way.
This is my former book.
So that's Lenin. But so maybe you could clarify a little bit the role of the Popular Front. I mean, my impression here in the United States is that, so I know, I read your article, so I forget what I read, but Popular Front came in, the Communist Party said, we're dropping, like you mentioned, the revolutionary stance, and we're making alliances with all kinds of other forces against fascism. But also it meant that they were much more favorable towards expressions of national and ethnic culture and identity. And that was true in the United States too, not just Jewish, but even like American. And you have all this art, that's very American and stresses the people, the American people, but also the ethnic, so the Jewish people or whatever it was. And it seems to me like the party left that, in the late 40s. But the Jewish groups, that was their favorite. That was their favorite period. They loved that period. They felt the most comfortable because they could be, like you said,
Of course.
both progressive and Jewish at the same time.
Yeah.
But in the United States, that kind of tore most of them away from the party in the 50s, 60s, and then especially in the 70s until there was almost no one left in the party. So I don't know if you'd say more about.
Well, firstly, I will start with this. You see, it's very interesting because here is no. Here. Yeah. This photo is for 1929. They had a network of Arbeiterschule, Marxist, Yiddish, Jewish schools for workers. And these schools were linked to the Yiddish section of the Communist Party. You know, the Communist Party had idiomatic sections, language sections, and the Yiddish one was one of the most important in Argentina, also the Italian one. But they were like 14 different collectivities with different languages. And the Jews were the Jewish section was the only one who could build a network of schools. And they declared they were Marxist, Leninist schools. I mean, they don't, they use Yiddish because it was their language, but they were not worried about Yiddish contents. But after, you see, this is the same audience, but in 1935, I mean 6 years later only, they were more Jewish. Why? This happened, you know, you see the pictures, Peretz, Mendele, Shalem Aleichem, the fall, and they changed the name. They changed Arbeiterschule for Volksschule because it was the popular front moment, and they need to do alliances with the bourgeoisie, the progressive bourgeoisie, and they were more comfortable indeed because Jewish people was progressing. I mean, they were becoming more established in the country, in the business. They were earning money, so many of them started to be owners in factories, in shops. So in the 50s and the 60s, there was a show about the red millionaires, no? And they were very criticized. How can you be communist and be the owner in a factory with 1,000 workers? So some people used to say, okay, well, if you are a communist, you are more kind with the workers and you understand them better. And, you know, it was a show that I liked very much. I would try to say in Vichalin, that was a textile factory neighborhood. One day, one workman go and ask the owner, Mr. Rosenberg, why do you treat us so bad? Why you exploit us so much if you say you are a communist? Well, this is for you to understand how bad is the capitalist system. So, I mean, yeah, that was a problem, and I think that they became more comfortable with the Popular Front movement, and they started to add Jewish content, because also the Jewish culture was threatened in Europe, and they start to receive all this information. And also in South America was the impact of the Jews as a bad influence for the country. So they started to defend the identity of being Jews, and was not the same atmosphere in the 20s. So what I say is there are many factors that converge in the moment. The international context was very important, but also the national situation in Argentina and South America, because I mean, the economical rise of these people, the growth of the fascism everywhere. So for many things, they start to change, and also the Education Council of Argentina, for instance, asked them to include Argentinian contents in the book. This is a book, for instance, from the Schules first grade, and you can see here, well, many compulsory pages about with the Argentinian flag, with the Argentinian, well, this is our escudo, I don't know. So this was compulsory. The government wanted to check all the books for, not only for Jews, for all the communities, the foreigner communities, and see that there are patriotic, Argentinian patriotic topics in the book. About Boone, Ivo, that and Rolansky, do you know Rolansky, and many others from the Boone, they had a school. I mean, before the pact from 1939, in the ICUF period, I mean 1937, they were talking about doing a movement together with the Bundist people. I mean, culturally, they were very similar. I mean, the only difference was the communist ideas or the anti-communist ideas. But they had a lot of common contents to teach together in the schools. But the problem was that when the Soviet-German pact, so they fight in that moment, the three lines of the left, I mean also Zionist. So, and after the Second World War, with the creation of Israel, the schools, Yiddish schools, start to change, because the main organizations, as AMIA and DAIA that I mentioned, they started to ask the schools to change the hours of teaching Yiddish for Hebrew. So they started to change the way of the programs were going. So the Bund remained with us one school in Yiddish until the 80s. I mean, Rolansky was one of the most important teacher for many years in the Bund. The Bund is people from Ivo. So the Yiddish culture was actually very centralized in Igbo, because ICUF start to change to the Spanish ICUF in the 60s and in the 70s. But well, and other question, no, I don't know. Yes.
So
Sorry.
we'll continue here. I just wanna ask a good question from an audience. They have cousins in Brazil. So they and the father of the cousins of the person who's asking was Moises Baumstein, the artist. And Moises Baumstein, an artist, and they are asking whether artist and he is part of the story of the leftist Jews.
Well, I don't know him.
Okay, so I guess not the story.
So sorry.
That's okay.
But I will check it. I will, after I will
I will
write down the
definitely.
name and I
So we
will
have
check.
one more question here and then
So-
we'll finish so we can chat and eat here, so.
Just a quick question about money. I always believe follow the money. So these organizations had buildings and stuff, and people had to be giving money, and I'm curious I know you're not an accountant, but I was wondering if you have a sense of financially how these institutions were supported, whether there were a few philanthropists and then a lot of poor people, or was it that the textile industry was robust and that there was adequate money coming in from all these other situations?
Very interesting question. I mean, they used to work, I used to say that the key for the life of these institutions were the activists. I mean, people who spend days, nights and weekends walking in the streets, asking for contributions in the factories, in the shops, and they pay in the clubs a small monthly membership. So with this, and they organize parties and kermeses and every kind of, but they were, dedicating the whole week. They used to live inside the institution, and the institution's problems were more important than ones of the home, I remember many people who I interviewed, many old people, but they were the children of the main activists who don't remember having their parents at home. They remember that their parents were always inside the palace, and they had to go there, and it wasn't like a home for many of us. That was the key. And when they need to paint tables or chairs, little ones from the kindergarten, the parents were there painting and making arrangements. It was by heart, a pulmón, how do you say? With volunteers.
Labor of love.
Yeah, that was the key. And this is important because I also think that in the 60s, when women start to they go in the market of
Labor
market, and they need another structure for the family. Young people go to university, and they started to do a different life from their parents, and the institutions start to lose activities and membership. For instance, it's very important because the Zionists in the 60s, the schools were complementary. I mean, in the morning, it was compulsory for them to go to the state school. And in the evening, they went to the Schule, the Yiddish school. But in the 60s, the Zionists to teach many contents about the new country Israel and to promote the Aliyah and all these things, they started to convert the schools in integral school. 8 hours the children inside the school. But in the ICUF congresses, there was a very deep debate about what to do with the shules, because they were losing people, because mothers and fathers, they were needed a big structure, 8 hours to put the children in the school. So they also had to change to be integral. But as they were communists, they were against the private schools. Mm-hmm. And they want to avoid, they want to avoid to generate an elite. So they decided not doing integrated schools, because they thought that if the Jewish children must be in one institution, only one, 8 hours, this institution must be the Argentinian school and not the Yiddish school, because we wanted to be Argentinian people, and this is our new society. So these kind of decisions were difficult for many of them, but they were, they thought they could transmit the progressive ideas through the education in free time. Summer camps, kinder clubs, and this.
Thank you.
So I'm sorry.
No, it's wonderful. Thank you so much. That invites